nice to be back with you all again. And I guess I'll get started. And Marshall will be coming a little bit later because he runs from another class. But before we start, I thought Sam McSeveny reminded me that some of you have had courses with Tom Schwartz, our wonderful colleague from the history department. Oh, shoot. We're having an alarm of some kind for weather. It's my clock. Okay. Well, we'll be safe, I'm sure. Anyway, yesterday, Tom Schwartz was awarded the Madison Surratt Prize for Excellence in Undergraduate Teaching and received a nice check and a beautiful little silver Mount, I started to say Mount Julep. Julep. And so some of you may want to know that. Okay, today we're supposed to be doing, moving along on our plan that Marshall and I created. I'm doing now slavery in British America, but I'm also throwing in a little bit of extra on the Dutch because we didn't talk about them at all. And then when I get to when we do the slave rebellion in Saint-Domingue, we'll touch on a little bit about the differences in French slavery and the others. So I know I raced through us last time when I did this, so I actually brought some notes today to remind myself where I was. And we'll do that first, and then I'll get you on to some pretty PowerPoints that I've put together. So this lecture today is going to introduce us to the earliest English slavery in North America, because I think probably people are more familiar with the antebellum slavery of the U.S. South. That 19th century plantation image is so powerful in our historiography and in our media that that's almost what everybody thinks of. It's really hard to sort of get behind that or before that when I'm teaching as well. And so, you know, images like Gone with the Wind and Roots, and more recently, Amistad. Some of those are images that we might be more familiar with. But the real early colonial past, when slavery is first instituted in what becomes the United States of America, is not as well known. So that's what I'm going to concentrate on today. And many of you may have seen American history textbooks or African American history textbooks that always start out 1619. That's the beginning date of African American history. And it drives me nuts because you saw that last week I started out in the Spanish Americas. And even if you're just talking about what later became the United States, Spanish Florida was discovered in 1513, so we're in that big anniversary year this year, and along on that voyage were both enslaved and free people of color. So I always start African American history in 1513, more than a century before the English will start working on slavery and instituting it here. So that's always the first thing I get at. Not 1619, but 1513 will start. So, and if you think about flipping it that way, it gives a whole different picture to how long we had slavery on our shores and what different kinds of slavery were possible or were actually working in those periods earlier. So 1619 is when supposedly a Dutch ship came up to Jamestown, Virginia, and unloaded, quote, 20 and odd Negroes. And the weird voyage of the ship that came into Jamestown, which all those Anglo-American textbooks count as the beginning of enslavement in British America, it has a very interesting background to it that also reminds us that the history of this early colonial period is much more African, much more diverse than later sort of Creole or born in the Americas slavery will be in antebellum South. So think more diverse, think more languages, more cultures, more religions, more experiences with other Europeans than British, and that's how we start off with our 20 and odd Negroes, okay? So it turns out that the 20 and odd Negroes had been captured and enslaved in Angola as a result of some Angola wars, and had been put on a Portuguese slaver, because the Portuguese were the earliest big-time slavers in the Old World. Later, the British will surpass them by far, but initially it's the Portuguese. And so Congo, Angola was already a colony of Portugal. And that means that from the beginning, when the Portuguese got to Congo and Angola, they tried to impart some of their culture and some of their religion in those areas. And one of the most important things that they install in Congo, Angola is the Catholic Church. So by the 16th century, we have a Catholic Church in Angola, and it's entirely possible that some of the people that were enslaved in the wars of the 1620s in Angola and then end up in Jamestown might have already been exposed to Catholicism. They might have been baptized already into the church. It certainly benefited them to be Catholic because that was the ruling power's faith. And one of the prime historians for this whole history is John Thornton. You might have seen some of his books. His wife, Linda Haywood, also worked on Angola in the modern period, and now they're doing most of the work on Congo, Angola, emphasizing the important role of the Catholic Church and the possibility that this culture that was transplanted as first groups into the Americas were already Catholic. May have spoken Portuguese as well, and may have had some experience with urban life if they lived in San Salvador in Angola. So this shakes up our images quite a bit, I think. So that's why we'll start there. And these 20 and odd Negroes get off the boat and are sold by the Dutch, who snatched them from the Portuguese earlier. So think of all those experiences: war, captivity, being put on a slave ship, having been pirated by another slave ship, and then sold in a brand new land that you don't know anything about, and getting off in a fairly rustic area at this point because Virginia was not settled yet either. These hands could be very useful, these extra hands, especially if they had any particular skills. So this is the beginning of slavery in Virginia, Congo, Angola, and quite a different experience. All right, so 1619, and if you want to follow that trail a little bit, by the time those slaves got there were already free people of color also being settlers in Jamestown. There's a wonderful small book about this early period called Mine Own Ground, spelled M-Y-N-E, Own Ground, and it is about the very first settlers. We have at least one census that shows that there were free people of African descent living in Virginia when those 20 and odd get off the boat. And one of the most important and interesting ones was a man named Anthony Johnson. Now, he might have started out in some sort of indenture because at the beginning there is no real distinction about slave-free, indenture, and so on. It's sort of a very rudimentary system at this point, and it'll take some while before English laws in all those places start to be instituted to talk about permanent, perpetual slavery, like we come to know it in antebellum slavery. So at this point, it's still, there's this loose area in law and in identity in Jamestown. And Anthony Johnson shows up on our censuses as a free person who has land, who ends up creating a paper trail for himself as he goes to court about his rights and his land and his property. And he ends up making his land base a plantation, which is probably glorifying it in our imagery because plantations meant any planted land with something produced on it. He calls his Angola. So it's very interesting. In the early 17th century, Virginia, a free man of color calling his plantation Angola, going to court and litigating about his tobacco and his land and his property and his children's inheritance and so on, and becoming a slave owner himself in Virginia. So this is to upset our ideas a little bit about Virginia as well, but later I'll show you George Washington and some more traditional early 18th century slave images. But this is to just get us going a little bit. And just to be clear, Anthony Johnson is an exceptional person. That's why we find him in the records. And many of the people that I end up studying are sort of the exceptions to the rule, the interesting, brave, determined, whatever, lucky it might be, that surface in these records in all these different national archives. And so there are many more people that we'll never know about, and many more that will stay enslaved to the rest of their days once that system is so horrendous and gets started. So a little bit about early Virginia, Chesapeake area. And when I say Virginia, I'm really meaning the larger Chesapeake, Maryland, and I'll show you some images of slaves from that area as well. Well, I wanted to say something also then about the Dutch, because right north of the Chesapeake, not too far, come in the Dutch. And they're in that area already by the 17th century too. So only 2 years after those 20 and odd Negroes got off the boat, a little bit farther south, the Dutch will start to explore and put down roots in what becomes New Netherlands. And they had a very interesting character that they used as their sort of lead into that area, a cultural broker, if you will. Many of these groups, like the Spanish, the Portuguese, the Dutch, and later the French, will find people of color who have multiple languages already, who have been exposed either in the African coast to various different types of languages, of cultures and religions and so on, or later in the Caribbean. But these people that sort of move between worlds are one of the groups that I really like and work on a lot. And they come to pick up the word to be used now, Creole, which probably if I say it in this room, everybody thinks about New Orleans and Creole cooking and Creole music and so on. But the word was originally a Portuguese word called criollo, and it meant somebody born in the African coast but who was multilingual, multicultural, a trader, an intermediary, and so on. And those very useful characters are part of that whole Atlantic expansion into the Caribbean and into North America as well. So the person that ends up doing it for the Dutch is a West Indian person from the Caribbean, a mulatto man named Juan Rodriguez. And he's the cultural broker for the Dutch that ends up making the first contacts with the Indian people there and setting up trading opportunities for the Dutch, who were a magnificent merchant group all over the world, spread thin, their little small population. They have to depend on these kinds of deals, either on the African coast, in the Caribbean, or in New Netherlands, because they're never going to have a huge population to hold that land with, and they have to be a little bit more malleable and more international in their approach with people. They can't come in and conquer wholeheartedly as other more powerful groups might later do. So the Dutch come in, and they've already had some experience in Africa, and they've already had some experience in the Caribbean with different kinds of people and with trading all over the world. And they set up a very interesting kind of slave system in New Netherlands. It's different than what we are more familiar with. They have a system called half freedom. And this is much like what the Spanish had. Also in the Spanish world, it's called coartación. It means slavery is considered really a natural freedom, and liberty is the natural condition of man, and so you should have ways to get free. And in the Spanish world, if you went to court and wanted your freedom, they would assess your value. Your owner could contest it and have a different assessor. There might be a third person to work out the difference, and then the price would be set. And at that point, you enter this sort of interesting limbo world where your owner has no more control over you. You agree to make these down payments towards your freedom, and the minute you're free, you get a piece of paper that eradicates all your liabilities as a slave, etc. And the Dutch, I think, modeling after this Spanish model, use this half-freedom idea also, that a slave can begin to move towards freedom by putting a down payment and then continuing to make that payment. And it's a contractual agreement in the Dutch world where they have so long to make the payments and they must make them or else kind of thing. But it means that there are people enslaved next to people who are on their route to freedom already, next to people who are already free and have traveled a lot of the world already. So the Dutch have another interesting system I just wanted to introduce us to. And the Dutch are not Catholics who welcomed the Africans into their churches in all these places that I mentioned, in Portugal or in Spain and all their holdings anywhere. They're Dutch Protestants, and it's the Dutch Reformed Church that's brought to New Netherlands, and yet that church also welcomes people of color and Indians into their church. So it is more open than we will find later Anglican churches to be in the South, for instance. So that's another interesting, sort of connection to what we've been looking at. You want to break in? Yes?
Yes, ma'am. I'm working on an oxymoron in my mind. If this person is a slave, how does he get funds to buy his freedom? And I already knew that they always want their freedom, but how does he get funds?
Okay, wonderful question. Well, there are many ways, actually, that the Spanish and the Catholics and the Portuguese always had, a huge calendar of feast days, Catholic saints' days, and Sundays were always holy days. And on all of those days, slaves were commonly permitted to manage their own gardens, manage their own animals, be sailors, be fishermen, be hunters. All of their other skills that they employed for the master on the regular days, they could use themselves. And under Roman law, there's something called peculium, which means your private property. And slaves had a right to their peculium. This thing is in my eye at this point, I think, isn't it? Okay. So by the peculium, the slave could keep what they earned. Now, if a horrible master wanted, they probably could have snatched it. But there's an interesting body of work now being done, even in the Antebellum South, that if everybody on that slave plantation knew that was your horse and you paid very dearly for that horse in all those days you worked, that the master would be probably it would be difficult for him to take it from you. So there's Roman law in all the Iberian world. The Dutch seem to have allowed this peculium, although theirs wasn't actually Roman law. And even in the Antebellum South, there's a certain amount of information now about what they call the underground slave economy, in which there was a lot of trading, bartering, and that kind of thing, but also even earnings, people who could take their extra produce to the market in Charleston or, pull some Spanish moss off the trees and sell it, or whatever it might be a wheelsmith or a cooper or whatever. And on your days extra, you got to keep it. And it's been studied in Louisiana and in the Caribbean as well, this underground economy where people have more property than you think. And if it's recognized by the community, and even more so if the law recognizes it, you've got a way. It could take a long time, but it can happen. And then I'll finish this thought. In Catholic world too, and maybe in others, these acts of charity and beneficence of granting freedom at the birth of a baby or at the marriage or at the death or whatever also allows the free black class to grow, and they will help pull their other family members out too. And you had a question?
I just wanted to be sure I understood that the slave has an absolute right to buy his way to freedom.
Yes.
And to not be stopped by the slave owner.
The slave owner can contest it, but it isn't allowed usually. So I have, for instance, in 18th century Spanish Florida, a very interesting slave named Felipe Edinburgh, because he was originally owned by English people. He has been promised by his master that because he saved his life, he'll free him. And then the master, Francisco Sanchez, who's the biggest planter in all of Florida, owns 9 plantations, hundreds of slaves, property in Cuba. He's a creditor for the government. The government's so strapped that they're borrowing money from him. And yet when he fails to free Edinburgh, Edinburgh takes him to court, and there's testimony, and Edinburgh gets free against the creditor of the government. So if that's sort of an example, I'm sure there are cases in which the slaves weren't so lucky, and only if they can find their way to a court can they do that. Anyway, if they're in the middle of some bayou or some cane field and never get to an urban judge, they're probably going to... Spanish and Portuguese. And the French also follow that law later too. So they're, but I know it best in the Spanish world where I've actually looked at the cases so well. Did I see Bob? No, it was next. Yes.
I've always wondered how free and slaves work. If a slave got free because he bought it himself, because his master gave him freedom, I assume they gave him a piece of paper that says he's free. What's preventing him from walking into town and some plantation owner said, "Hi, you must be a runaway slave," put him in chains and take him back?
Well, that's a great question. If you're in a small enough community in these early periods right up through the early 1800s, some of these places are fairly small still. I started out on St. Augustine. I'm going to show you a little PowerPoint at the end on that. But my community was small enough, everybody knew everybody. They knew whose slaves were whose and so on. And slaves reported if something happened untoward like that, they would run to the judge themselves and say, so-and-so just got taken by some man from Georgia that didn't know who he was. And there's a lot of that crossover across international borders. And the Spanish try to get them back from wherever they've been taken by pirates or by people who shouldn't have taken them. It doesn't mean it doesn't happen. In a larger city, I guess, as we create larger cities in Latin America, I'm sure somebody in Mexico might have been grabbed because it's such a huge place and might have, just been lost to everybody. But the law meant anybody could report the injustice and it had to be remedied. Yes?
Okay, now, Spanish always controlled the people and it controlled the slaves and it controlled the writings and everything. But in the American South, that didn't happen to that extent.
I'm sorry, in the American South what?
That the slavery was slave by the freedom. I know there was different freedom, but sometimes they had that free day.
In the English world? In the English world, once this becomes the United States, is that one you're talking about? It's customary to allow slaves on Sundays to do some of their own work, and so it would vary from place to place, I'm sure. And then you have to have some place to sell whatever it is you're making and doing on Sunday, so you have to be close enough to a market for that kind of thing. So if we're talking about the places near the Atlantic coast where there are ports and you can sell and people are coming in and out, that's one thing. If you're stuck in the middle of a cane field or an antebellum place in Antebellum, Alabama, you're probably not going to have that opportunity. Plus, it's going to tighten down as the slave planters have more power in the antebellum period. And that history of freedom is sort of erased out. Okay, so we got the Dutch up and going. We got the idea that they had experiences all over the world and that they had this sort of amalgam, basically, of a Dutch, Anglo, Protestant, Catholic world going there in New Netherlands. And at the same time that they're developing New Netherlands, they're also grabbing the northern part of Brazil, and they also grabbed Angola. And so they've got a pretty integrated system of bringing slaves to Brazil for sugar plantations where it would have been a lot harder to get any of those kinds of rights because you're out in a cane field and you're not near a city and so on. But if you were in New Netherlands, if you were one of those Angola people taken by the Portuguese to New Netherlands, you got a better shot. Yes, sir?
When we refer to New Netherlands, what geographic area?
So this is New York where we're starting out. Yes, sir. And there was a brief Swedish period where I have not studied anything about Swedish slavery, and nobody has, I think. But actually, one of my graduate students is now looking at the small Swedish attempt to get African slaves and have a fort on the African coast. So the Germans and the Swedes will follow the Dutch into the African coast, but it's a minimal kind of operation. Okay. So any more questions on that section? Because we're going to move on then, I think, out of the north a little bit and get to some places that I'm a little bit more familiar with, and that's the Carolinas. So we have areas of the Atlantic coast that are not really settled in, and they're small settlements. We're moving down through really pretty rugged territory into later what becomes Charleston, South Carolina in 1670. So we're moving from the 1620s and 30s down forward in time and down south to the Carolinas, where the English will come up from Barbados and try to get a toehold into the Atlantic coast, which has been claimed by Spain, ever since 1513. Spain said, no, 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 that whole North American coast is ours. We have planted a flag, notarized it, and named it, and we have a little place at St. Augustine after 1565, and we got Pensacola before that, and so no, this is ours. And they counted Florida, everything from the Keys to Newfoundland and west to the mines of Mexico. Now, they had a small population and couldn't have held that either, but in their view, they held it. So they were very upset when the English came in from Barbados, having run out of land and filled their island basically with slaves and sugar and made huge profits on it, the English. From 1624 on, they're going to eventually run out of space and look for other places to plant this very prosperous sugarcane economy with African slaves as the labor. Sugar started in the Middle East and moves through the Atlantic, through Spain, out to the Azores and Portugal too, and then off to the Caribbean, and then eventually to us. And it's a horrible labor, as we talked about before. And this is what the English wanted to get going again in Charleston. Well, they called it Carolina. It was a chartered company. It was an investment. They wanted to make money. And they already had a certain amount of capital, and they already had slaves. They already knew how to do sugar, and that's what they want to do in Carolina. But it takes a while to get that up and going, because you have to clear a lot of huge dense forests to get those sugarcane fields. So in the meantime, they do indigo, which is a little bush which makes nice blue dye, and that's profitable. Slaves did that. They plant rice. That's a lot harder. When they did those dikes and all those canals, they say it's equivalent to building a pyramid almost, putting all that labor in. So a lot more Africans needed for that. They also did naval stores, timbering and lumbering, and they also ran cattle through those woods in Carolina early on. So Africans did a very diverse kind of labor at the beginning of Carolina. It wasn't straight to the sugar fields. It was all of these other things. And if you think about it, that's a pretty independent life, riding on horseback to catch cattle in the woods, going off to cut down timber and get it to the coast and haul it off. And so people, wonderful scholar Peter Wood, if you have a chance to read about Carolina, my favorite book about Carolina is called Black Majority by Peter Wood, who was a Duke for many years and who was basically my model for everything I did after that, talks about those first Africans into Carolina. Again, we're trying to break out of stereotypes and images. He talks about them as black pioneers, and that's a more apt imagery. Yes, sir?
I had heard, and I'm asking you if this is true or not, that the early production of food and timber and things like that in Carolina was not to send back to the mother country. It was to furnish these things to the already established plantation cultures in the Caribbean.
That's right. There's a lot of exchange outward. That's their market. The British later will put sort of bonuses on certain productions like wood that they need for their navies. But in the beginning, it's food for and that's the exchange that happens. And there's yes, they are producing rice in great amounts, some other small crops too, but they also have to sustain the population they have as well. But it's not a big market outward yet in this early phase when we're still pioneers, okay? And but Barbados had already instituted a very harsh British system of slavery. And that is what they're going to transplant with their capital and their slaves to Carolina. And there's the rub, because they're going to bring into the middle of what I've sketched out as fairly fluid kinds of slave systems this much harsher, tighter slavery that they're trying to stick in the middle there in Carolina. And it's the Anglo-Saxon system of slavery based on chattel property, which means the slaves are like this, right? That you can count them and identify them and number them and price them and sell them apart from families and so on. So the property idea trumps the idea of slaves as a casualty of war or an accident of fate through no fault of their own, no character influences about it, and no racial influences about it. If you're bringing it from Barbados to this place, it's the English model that they've established in Barbados, which is white masters, black slaves, sugar, horrible labor, horrible punishments, and tight supervision and tight control, and you don't want anybody to get out of it. And that's what they're going to implant in Carolina. But it's easier to have that on an island where you can control and you can't get, off it unless you have a boat. Sorry, this is just this awkward. And all my hair, I guess that's part of the problem. So they could do it in Barbados, but if you try that in Carolina, where there's big piney woods right to the edge of the plantation, and there are Indian nations right inside there too that you might run to, and if you think that later down the road a piece down south, there's a whole Spanish world that's quite different. St. Augustine has a different set of laws, has a different set of ideas about enslaved people and about race and about religion and so on. It doesn't take enslaved people very long to figure out a lot of routes out of that system. So although the English wanted it real tight like they had it in Barbados, it's not going to happen. And from the minute they get those slaves on the ground in Carolina, we start to see them running away. And you can track it through all the sort of really interesting records. They have an organization or an agency called the Board of Trade and Plantations, and you can track every year all reports for anywhere there were British colonies. It's a really interesting source because you can see about, Indian rebellions in all these different places, or slave rebellions in all these places, or what the trade was like in those places, or drought, hurricane, epidemics, whatever, because the English are watching all of their colonies everywhere, and it's so neat to compare what's going on in those different places. So you start to see all the complaints about runaways, and some are going off to live with the Indians and to come back and bite the Carolinians, and some are running down to Spanish Florida who will come back and bite the Carolinians too. And so they're not possible, it's not possible initially to get that tight chattel slavery. Okay? So we wanted to get Carolina up, and then all of a sudden there's Georgia in the middle there too, that's established in the 1730s, carved out of what was Carolina amorphously. Another idea about coming in and, if we're having all this trouble with slaves and constant revolts in our little Charleston and running away out to the boondocks, here's a colony we could put as a buffer between Florida and Carolina, and in this new colony, this sort of ideal colony of Georgia, we will not allow slavery. We'll make nice yeoman farmers, and it'll be all white, and it'll be all English. A few Germans came in, actually, but it'll be white, and we'll have small planters and farmers in here, and we'll do nice industries, and we'll be profitable. They tried odd things like putting silk production into Georgia, little silkworms that you have to hand put onto the leaves, and it was not a proposition that worked out. But they did better with livestock and cotton later. So they got going, but their idea about being this ideal place without slavery wasn't working, as the people that were brought in as settlers were getting more and more miserable, and the economy wasn't taking off. And they're watching Charleston to the north with their chattel doing a pretty good job by this time, getting some nicer plantations up and going. And all of the people are whining and wanting slavery in Georgia, too. So although they had a wonderful document at the beginning stating their principles about they would never enslave anybody, it's given up by about the 1750s, and the colony is sort of a disaster. So I've got us down, I'm edging us, you see, my motivation is getting us to Spanish Florida because, again, I'm going to try to make these connections that maybe aren't as familiar to you in other of the textbooks that you might have read, but because I accidentally ended up at the University of Florida, where I meant to do Brazilian studies, and ended up finding all of these neat documents about the colonial South and about Spanish Florida. I ended up deviating from Plan A, and I became a historian of Spanish Florida, which seemed so bizarre. My director didn't want me to do it. It was like, who cares about Florida? It's not Latin America. It's not U.S. What is it? And I followed the trail anyway because I couldn't help it. And eventually it ended into a wonderful project that I'm going to show you about at the end. How's my time doing? Because I talk fast, but I never know. How much? Okay, and we've got to... 40 minutes, thank you. Okay, good. Well, I'm inching us down south to get us to some of the conflicts that will occur as all these empires try to carve out pieces of what becomes the United States. Before we're the United States, all this interest. We're going to hold France for later, but it's going to have interest in Louisiana from this early period too, and it's going to be a disaster at the beginning too, and we're going to look at it later. But just to let you know then, the French, the Spanish, the Dutch, Swedes for a little bit, are all here competing with ideas about slavery. And the biggest contest ends up being between the bigger powers, which are Spain and England. And it's going to revolve around runaways from Carolina going to Spanish Florida. And it's a major source of international conflict. So I bumbled into it not knowing anything about it, and I was just thinking these are neat records. And lo and behold, it comes to have a fairly important global significance because of the conflict between these legal systems and the runaways between these places. So it will have some importance. Okay, so maybe what I'll do now is move us through some of those earlier images, and then we'll take off for Spanish Florida. Okay, I wanted to put up some images about, again, tried to find images that weren't the typical ones maybe, about Virginia. So what Virginia had were these lush lands that end up being tobacco lands, and they had a nice river system that went up it, and large land holdings of elite planters who were fairly dispersed. And so one of the things people study about slavery is the demography of slavery. If you're in a place where there are hundreds of other slaves living in the same area with you, we now know that there were many people who could recreate cultures, languages, families, religion, and so on, and have some community again. There used to be an idea called social death. Orlando Patterson, sociologist, thought if you were alienated from your kin and ripped out of Africa, you lost your humanity, your kinship, your identity, souls practically. And there was a long period in which people talked, and it was part of the response to the horror of the Middle Passage. In sympathy, people talked about how horrible it was, but they went so far as to say everybody lost their minds, basically, and ended up as these sort of blobs in the New World without any idea of culture. And so, and here I'm reading all this stuff about everybody speaking 8 languages and being traders and having families and roaming around the Atlantic, and I'm going, wait a minute, these people are not socially dead, and they certainly are able to recreate cultures and so on, given the proper circumstances. Everything's contingent on where you are, when you're there, what the crop is, what the law is. So we just want to break out of our ideas of that antebellum, that's the only model, right? So tobacco was a thing in Virginia, and they would come up to the coast and then take small boats up the rivers and disperse a few here, a few there at all of those plantations. That's a dispersed group, and they came in small lots, and eventually there might be hundreds on some of those plantations, but I think that's a different experience than going straight to a place where there are already hundreds of people who might receive you and welcome you and train you and so on. So anyway, tobacco is the early crop. The drum at the top I put in there deliberately. It was found in Virginia and sent to England, and it's from the late 17th century, we think, or early 18th century. And somebody, African, made that beautiful drum, and it's quite crafted, beautiful craftsmanship, so much so that the person that found it shipped it back to England as an example, and it's been in a museum ever since. And it's to remind us that although the labor is brutal and there is more supervision in the Anglo world, that even there's a certain amount of culture being maintained and recreated and reshaped on whatever little spare time might have been. And somebody had to put a lot of work into that object. And that was something that wasn't going to be sold. That's for the community. You know, that means you took time away from the stuff you could have sold to make that. So I thought it was important. And then tobacco was a big market ever since anybody got addicted to it. So that was the crop for Virginia. And there are a lot of beautiful labels for tobacco products that people now look at those labels as a form of history too, or text to be read. Our colleague Catherine Molyneux does very interesting work on imagery and how you read it, and I'm no expert on it, but it does have some very realistic elements in this about how they packed tobacco in the crates and so on, and somebody had to make those crates, and then somebody else has to hoe, and somebody else has to burn off forests, and think of the diverse labors. And this is Virginia and tobacco. And eventually, after enough effort on the part of those African slaves, people amassed wealth, and our own founding fathers, George Washington, held slaves, had slave runaways, punished slaves, also freed some, and had house servants. In this picture, you can hardly see the African man on to the left because he's painted. I'm sorry, my image is sort of dark, and it might be the lighting, but he has a beautifully dressed house servant to the left of his family. Those people in the big house had a much different experience than those people out in the fields. And so again, there's a variety of experiences based on where you are and what you're doing. And I looked for some other Virginia Chesapeake kinds of images, and here's Governor Spotswood of Virginia's black nursemaid for his children. She has a better position than someone out in the fields. She has a necklace on. She has pretty nice clothing. She's taking care of the kids. On the left, you see an image from Norfolk, Virginia, that's Benjamin Latrobe went around the South and painted some beautiful watercolors and sketchbooks of daily life, and I always love those because they seem more, real somehow. And he spotted those African-American men in Norfolk on their free day barbering, and that's an occupation you could earn some money with, and it also has in Africa a healing component, barbers, and even in our Anglo world, barber surgeons kind of people. So he might have been cutting hair, and he might have been also on the side healing somebody for a little extra cash or whatever, eggs, whatever it might be. And also to remind us how a variety of people and cultures and language and religion came into even Virginia, where we think about, Mount Vernon is our image there, right? Well, there are famous Muslim slaves who came into, only a few, again, the exceptional that get painted by Charles Wilson Peale, for instance. But if we have some, we can think there may be others that just didn't catch the attention of the officials or got painted. And I find Muslim slaves in Georgia as well. And somebody has done a book on the Muslims in North America by the name of Austin. They're few, but they're there, and that's another religious idea and another experience. And often they were made to be the overseers because they were sober, industrious people who didn't drink and were very respectable and responsible, and they had literacy and so on. So this famous gentleman was a Muslim who had been enslaved possibly in one of the wars in the Futa Jalon area and sent to Baltimore, and he was educated and literate, and so he caught the attention of artists and eventually was freed. But these are several of his images. And then if you know the area in Georgia, Sapelo, I went to look around in Sapelo for different things and related to the cultures between, they call the Low Country, Charleston and southward. And on Sapelo Island, there was one of these Muslim overseers named Ben Ali, who his descendants still live there. If you want to read a very nice book, Cornelia Bailey is like the historian of Sapelo Island. Her family's lived there for generations in hog hammock, and she walked me all over that island, showed me what plants did what and where people were buried, and she's a descendant of a literate Muslim overseer who they're very proud of these days. Now, the southeast was a rugged area, so there are some plantations close to the coast, and there are a few ports. If we go Charleston, we could then go Darien and Savannah, and I'm geographically challenged, so maybe I have those backwards, but we have this long coastline. We have some cities down the coastline. The interior still indigenous, and much of the interior still looks like this that Winslow Homer painted in the 1800s, 1890s he painted this. And if you go down from South Carolina, drive down the coast to Florida, you'll see stuff like this still. So anybody that was running, you have to think, we only get the people that made it to the other side. How many people died along the way? English got worried about all the runaways that they were experiencing, and they would pay Indians to trap them, bring them back, or bring their scalps or ears back as proof that they didn't get away, because every runaway is a bad example to the others who will run. So you want to stop it, nip it in the bud, and they were brutal about it. So they would send Indians to track them, dogs to track them, or they'd die there, possibly. Other Indian groups helped African runaways. So again, it's contingent on who can you communicate with, who can you make an alliance with, who can guide you, who knows the way to St. Augustine. Well, fortunately for many of the runaways, there were many Indians that had gone back and forth up and down that coast for centuries, and they were ready to guide some of them. So, so we're looking at, that coastline, and from Charleston down to St. Augustine, they'd had to run through areas like that. And just to show you a little bit of what they're running from South Carolina, again, to try to have a couple different images. This is a little bit later, but by the 1800s, we had big plantations there like we had in Virginia and the Chesapeake. And the difference, again, that's sort of highlighted by these landscapes and environments and geography. Distance is what I want you to see here. Look, these slave houses are far away from the big house. The only people that are inside that big house are like the nice nursemaid, the nice valet, the cook, and the rest of the people live distant. And people study maps to see where are the slave quarters versus the plantation. Archaeologists study what kind of culture is happening out here in the slave quarters versus what we're finding here. And art can tell us something about that. And the idea being that supposedly culture isn't happening out in those quarters, but here on the left, I always ask my class, what do you see in there that would indicate some elements of culture? Instruments. Mm-hmm. So you see some drums, you see some jugs you could blow into and make music with, you see some little sticks, you see a banjo, that's an African instrument, and they're having, it's titled A Slave Dance, it's from the 1780s, but also the head wraps, I'm sorry?
The clothes.
And the clothes?
They look decently dressed.
Yes, they're very nicely dressed, so they got some handoffs usually from the big house. If it's a good master, he's sort of reflected in the care of his slaves as well. And this is a dance, so probably everybody has their best gear on. And people always talk about the jumping the stick thing, and that has come to become an idea in African American history that that's somehow a marriage ceremony. If it is, it's very late and it's very faux, I think, but we'll leave it there. Anyway. Now, okay, here we're getting to my second part, but I just wanted to say we had an alternate slave system right across the St. Mary's River, which is the border between what was Georgia and Florida. It's not that big a river. If you've ever been there, I've taken some pictures where you could see how easily you could get across it if you're determined to get across. And so pretty soon, slaves were slipping away. And the first ones that I found were actually 1687. It was 2 men and 3 women and a nursing child in a canoe that made it. And a canoe is probably the safest way to go rather than through that jungle. So canoes were often the way. And these people showed up in St. Augustine and said that they wanted to be Catholics, that the Protestants wouldn't let them be, and they were escaping, and they were making this appeal. Please keep us, we want to be Catholic. And the Spanish governor is a Catholic governor, and there's a tradition of harboring and giving sanctuary to people who want your help. And so in the days of dictatorships, if you could run in a church, you could claim religious sanctuary. Here, they're running across the St. Mary's River to St. Augustine claiming religious sanctuary. And it's not formal yet, but it's in the medieval tradition to do that. And so the governor keeps writing, all the governors keep writing back to Spain, say, what do we do? And more people kept coming. And once some made it, others started making it. There could have been earlier, but the first documented group, 1687, pretty early. and a nursing baby. And 2 women made it in that canoe. And apparently they murdered one of the slave owners on their way out of town. And that was the basis. The English really wanted those people back. And the English didn't get them back. So more come. And eventually the King of Spain finally answers all of those petitions about what do we do with these people. And this is the original document. Oops, I'm sorry, that ran off the edge a little bit. But it says, giving liberty to all, the men as well as the women. And usually when people study runaways, they always think how heavily male it is, because women have to care for babies and old people, and, you know, it's harder. But there were women who did it, too. And some I found went on their own, 2 women in a canoe, and made it. Giving liberty to all, the men as well as the women, so that by their example and by my liberality, others will do the same. So it's a deliberate poke in the eye to the English to say, keep running, and we'll keep getting, we'll take care of you. Because Spain is small and weak and spread all over the place, it has this little tiny garrison at St. Augustine with hardly any people in it, and they can use all of this interesting free labor that's coming in, and they can also drain the plantations of South Carolina if they're lucky. And so it was a political move, but it really, I don't want to sound too cynical, because at base, it's a religious sanctuary. And because it happens here, I've started looking, and it's everywhere in the Caribbean. They start to do this. So pretty soon, there are people running from Protestant Jamaica to Catholic Cuba or to Catholic Puerto Rico. There are people running from Dutch Curacao, Protestant Curacao, to Spanish Venezuela. And it's just movement all over the place once that policy is made by Spain. And then you can study back in the Spanish archives all of the high-level diplomatic complaints about it from the Dutch, the French, the English, demanding that the Spanish crown abolish this policy. And they hold it for over a century. Yes, sir?
Could you contrast the percentage that would flee to the Spanish authorities in Florida as opposed to the Seminole Indians?
Well, there were no Seminoles yet. What we have is creeks, and once we find some Seminoles, I'll sort of work them in at the end. They would flee. They fled to the Tuscarora first up in the Carolinas. Then they flee to the Yamasee, and they take part in the great big Yamasee War of 1715 that Peter Wood also writes about, and which I'm trying to study in more depth now. So they will go to a lot of different Indian groups, and eventually in the early 1800s, the Seminoles, late 1700s and early 1800s.
But did more go to the Indians or more go to the Spanish?
Oh, that's really hard to tell, because we get documentation in the cities, but the Seminoles weren't keeping archives on them. So when the Seminoles bring them in to get them baptized in St. Augustine, I have them. And the Seminoles did eventually ally with the Spanish, but first they were allied with the English. So maybe we can work that in too. Okay, anyway, so here we have the policy that's going to change the whole thing. And to resume, to repeat what we're trying to get across, some of these ideas, and then I'm going to quickly put up another one. We have Africans everywhere there is a Spanish society in both the Old and the New Worlds. There are all these different roles, and what I wanted to remind everybody is that Spain controlled huge, or thought they did, huge areas of what became the U.S. So the whole southern tier and both the coasts were claimed by Spain. So you could go all the way up to Alaska, and that would be counted as Spanish on the Pacific coast, all the way up to Newfoundland. And there were at least some explorations and things up there. And certainly the whole southern tier, from California to Florida, it was Spanish, and so Africans were in all those places, and you can track them in the records if you go to the Spanish archives, because they're very anal record keepers, and it's always the same kind of records. So the lessons learned in little Spanish Florida, which I thought was insignificant at the beginning, but I knew it had neat records, I can use that same model in any of these places now, because I know the categorization, the legal status, the so on. So, and then again, to just hit you over the head one more time, slavery is not chattel slavery in Spanish and Portuguese areas, and that African cultural traditions will be in places you might not expect, okay, because of that older idea that said there was social death and everything was eliminated. And I'm saying, no, there were plenty of elements there. You have to look for it in archaeology or art or documents or music or food or the use of the land, the things that are planted, all of those things. Okay, so that little slide is over, and let me see if I can now get... I wanted to share with you, I hope that you don't mind and it doesn't seem self-serving, but I worked on Spanish Florida and it ended up becoming a project that has developed into a public history, a National Historic Landmark, and it's on our topic, so I'm going to show you if you'll bear with me. Oops, here we come. Okay. Okay, so when those runaways kept running in, eventually there's a sort of critical mass, and by now we have the legal policy, the Crown is upholding it in all these different places, and enough have come into St. Augustine that they have to do something with this group of people. And what they do is model that group of refugees like they modeled Christian Indian refugees. Those English didn't like Christian Indian missions all the way across the South either, and they were always attacking and burning out the Catholic missions and swooping away thousands of indigenous slaves. The Appalachee from Florida are brought up to be sold out of Charleston down back into the Carolinas, so there's a tremendous slavery of Indians as well during this time period. I want to make sure everybody knows. And it almost did away. We thought the Appalachee were eradicated by English planters from Carolinas in 1702 and 04 and 05. So a tremendous Indian slavery is happening at the same time. And so there's continuing Anglo-Spanish religious conflict, warfare, raids, back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. And now we have about 100 or so people in St. Augustine, and they're gearing up for another Spanish-Anglo war. The War of Jenkins' Ear is coming down the road, right? So the Spanish say, okay, like we took care of those refugee Indians and gave them land and made it a town of their own, led by their own natural leaders, we're going to give all of these Africans a town of their own, led by their own natural leaders. It'll be a legal town. Spaniards love towns. They didn't like wandering people. They want to settle you in a Roman-based urban model. And they're going to make these little villages all around St. Augustine of Indians and one African village. And that's the one that I started tracking years ago. And it's 20, how many years? 30 years down the road. Ooh. Anyway, it ended up becoming a museum exhibit as I was graduating from the University of Florida, and it went all around the country. First, they said, I forget, 7 million people saw it. It went around for years and years and years, and it's been repatriated, I guess, to St. Augustine, where eventually a local community group made themselves the Fort Mose Historical Society, raised money, bought the land. Well, actually, the state took the land from the landowner as eminent domain because of the historic importance of the place. And it's the first free black town in what is the United States. And it was founded in what was Spanish Florida. And so they raised money, they got the land, they eventually made a little museum there, and if you go to St. Augustine today, you can visit it. And it was a wonderful experience to get to work with the archaeologists, the artists, the museum people, and the school teachers, and to create school materials and get it in the textbooks and, you know, have it marked on the highways. And so, you know, usually get that much satisfaction out of a dissertation. So here's my big message. You know, not 1619, not Jamestown, and not enslaved as the beginning of African American history. I always use this little image of Juan Garcia, the man that came with Juan Ponce de Leon to discover Florida in 1513. So he's all over Florida now because it's the 500th year anniversary. So he's everywhere, but he had a lot of adventures, and here he's off with Cortez to conquer the Aztecs. But again, the idea that because these are human beings, free human beings, they have paper trail, they have property, they have history, we can track them all over the Atlantic world. Okay? And I found others that the artists for the museum exhibit made these pictures. I have no idea what Juanillo looked like, but he had been shipwrecked on the Florida coast, and the Indians did not kill him, and he lived there 8 years, and so by the time Menendez de Avila settles Florida in 1565, wow, what a catch. He's found these guys that know all of the indigenous languages and the cultures and can be those cultural brokers like we had at the beginning in New Netherlands or in the African coast. So they put him on the payroll. He works for the Spaniards after that and facilitates the establishment of Spanish Florida that way. And he's got a military record now. I found this man later on down the road a little bit in the records. He was a free black military man because the Spaniards needed every hand they could get. They made black militias all the time like we saw before, and they made Indian militias when they could. Paper trail, privileges, no trial by a civil court, only by your military peers, no tribute, some uniforms, records, and supposedly gratitude of the Spanish crown. And this man, Crispin de Tapia, was a corporal in the St. Augustine militia in 1673. And on his times when he wasn't fighting, he was a store owner. We have records of his store. And another man that I found, and I just tried to find different characters that they could talk about in the exhibit. So if you stand under this little funny thing, their voices come out and you hear their story. And Juan Merino was a convict blacksmith from Havana, had gotten into some problem there and got shipped in exile to work in St. Augustine. And that's a really important skill that everybody needs, especially a military post. And so he was an important part of the community. And also in the African context, blacksmithing, I don't know where he came from. I have to do more on him. But blacksmithing in Africa is a very important guild that you're admitted into, and in the English world too. It's a guild, and you have to work your way up to master craftsman and so on. But it has a religious component in Africa and some of the African cultures as well, as founders of nation states in Congo, for instance, and it has the idea in Africa. One of my archaeology friends had a kiln, and it was to make iron with, and it had two breasts on it because you put the iron in the top and you melt it, and something different comes out the bottom. And it was that idea of birth and rebirth and change. And so, you know, a Spanish person probably just saw ironsmithing, but an African might have seen all kinds of things about this man who might have real importance among their community and be considered a convict in the other. And then I had to try to find some women who don't appear as much but do appear in Spanish records because of the voice allowed in Spanish legal documents. Women can file suits and hold property, and that's part of that interesting difference too between English law and Spanish law. And so Isabel de los Rios was a free woman who baked goods and sold them out in the street, and we have her. Well, anybody that came running in had to run and say what they wanted. They're coming in, presenting themselves to the governor. You can visit this house today, still in St. Augustine, where these people came and different governors received them and granted them sanctuary. And they were very important to the military support, so I showed one of the fort pictures. So they were often standing guard in those places and defending that place. When the English would attack, as they continued to do throughout those years, they and their Indian allies attacked St. Augustine right up to the end. All the townspeople would go into the safety of this big fort, and then the militias would be out there like the guerrillas on the outside, taking care of everybody. So military men all over the Spanish world, I think we talked about a little bit already, had this military trail and military uniforms and status and honor that they wouldn't have had in other cultures. So that's another institution besides law and church that's very, very, very important to Africans in these worlds. And that's an officer from Havana and another from Veracruz, and each one has their own long military trail that you can find of generations of families serving the military. And so what they did with the Mose people, St. Augustine, if you've been there, is, you know, used to be a walled city like all the medieval cities. And the Indian refugee towns are those little blocks outside the walls. And Mose is one farthest outside the wall because it's the newest. And it's also, if you look at it, on the border between where those English are going to hit. And they're the first line of defense, basically, for the town of St. Augustine. And then I had an archaeologist, a wonderful woman named Kathleen Deegan, got on my doctoral committee and helped raise the funds from the Black Caucus of the state legislature for all this research. And they sent me back to Spain to look for maps and history. And meanwhile, she got busy on raising money for a dig, and we did several seasons of dig at this place. It's just 2 miles outside St. Augustine. It's really easily marked now, so you could find it. But I looked for maps and so on. Well, you know, the English weren't happy about this free town, armed people driving more runaways to come to them and so on. So they decided to get rid of it, and they mounted joint operations, South Carolina, Georgia, and Jamaica, to eradicate Spanish Florida once and for all. We're in the middle of the War of Jenkins' Ear, so there was something, you know, political about the way the governor finally put a town right there on the northern border. But the fleet comes up from Jamaica, and from South Carolina and Georgia come down Oglethorpe, General Oglethorpe, James Oglethorpe from Georgia, and a lot of South Carolinians and Indians and Africans in a massive attack. There's a big siege at St. Augustine. Everybody's huddled inside for a month, and my guerrilla guys are out there fighting to try to drive back the English. And disease helps them too, because those English were dropping like flies in the jungles. But this is the image they made from my captain, Francisco Menendez, who is a Mandinga man who was literate, who had been enslaved and taken from Senegambia somewhere to Carolina. He was in the very founding generation of Carolina and joined the Yamasee Indian War in 1715. And when the English finally defeat all of them, they run down to Spanish Florida, and that's where I found him. And he gets free eventually, not easily. I'm doing a biography on him now is my next project, because I'll come back to him. He's got such an interesting life. And he's the leader. He is the natural leader. He is always first on the list. He commands the other. He files petitions on their behalf and so on. And there's a big battle out at my town of Mose, the English attacking it because it's their little town. And so an artist made this image. It's not exactly accurate, but it is a big battle there. And the little town is pretty well shattered by this, and so for the next 12 years or so, people just live in St. Augustine. And when more and more English pressure comes, they try to reestablish this place in the 1750s. Here's one of Menendez's petitions to the King of Spain. After that big battle, he writes to the king and he says, here's what I did for you, and here's all my bravery and my service, and I didn't cost you a dime, and I want the captaincy, you know, formal captaincy and so on. And the governor of Spanish Florida confirms all of this with a cover letter, and he doesn't hear from him. The king didn't answer him, so he wrote a second one, and he didn't still get an answer. And so the next time he decides, well, I'll just take a boat and I'll go to Spain and talk about it myself with the king. And so he becomes a corsair on the Atlantic, and a poor man gets picked up by a British or by a Boston-based corsair called the Revenge, and I found him later in the Admiralty Court records. He'd been sold as a slave in the Bahamas, and yet he gets back here and runs this place again. So you can see why I'm attracted to this man, and I'm going to write a biography of him. But he is literate. And another source of our records are these marriage records and Catholic baptismal and marriage and death records. And the neat thing about them is that they tell you exactly what ethnic group everybody is. So Juan Fernandez is a Carabalí from Old Calabar who has married Flora de la Torre, who's a Congo woman, and she's still a slave. So, but under Spanish and Catholicism, there were rights to conjugal visits and so on. And at this point, she's a slave. Later, I find her free, and so he has probably got her out of slavery. But all of these records are there too. So I'm trying now to. I got money from the Catholic Church to digitalize. These are the oldest records for blacks and Indians in the country, and they're digitalizing them. We trained the students how to do it, and pretty soon it'll be up on the Vanderbilt webpage, thanks to Paul and Flo. And this is an artist rendering after we did the archaeology and we put together the maps, and then we had NASA overhead satellite photography done. It was a whole bunch of different disciplines that got us the information here. This is supposedly what Mose looked like, a small little place with a river back up to it, and another idea about it. And you could see it from St. Augustine. You could get down a little canoe and be there in a second. And there's Representative Clark was our big supporter on the left, and Kathy Deegan is the blonde curls in the middle, and the volunteers. And then we brought up a Haitian student that she works with in the northern coast of Haiti to train him on this site, since it's African-American site in the U.S. And there's some of the aerial photography that we had. NASA and the color, infrared color, can show you that straight line is just because everybody was walking out to the site all the time. That wasn't really, but it mapped the way the maps did, that on that curve of that river we found it. And then some, ideas about them digging, and it's a very thin occupation, a short amount of time they were there, from 1738 until the Spanish get burned out in 1740. They started again in 1752, and then the English are going to take over Florida in 1763. So short. But we get some things out of it, and so it had a lot of military, people were shooting up a storm in there, and they were smoking, apparently, these pipes, and they were making bone buttons. And the one on the left is a really neat pewter image of St. Christopher, who has been demoted, I understand, but was the patron saint of travelers, and carried Jesus across the water on his shoulders. And so this is an apt imagery of Africans who were brought across the water, and corsairs like my guy Menendez, who thought nothing of getting on a boat and going up and down the Atlantic, and then he was going to head to Spain, so he might have been wearing that, I don't know. And then pottery and lots of drinking went on at the side, military bottle. And then our beginning little exhibit that we started in 1991 that went all around. And it took a long time, but finally Jeb Bush decided to recognize this as a National Historic. We had to nominate it and go through the process of documenting everything that happened there. And then it was made a National Historic Landmark, and then it was made a state property. And now we have family from the communities playing reenactors and running the whole thing. And I went back there for 30-year anniversary last year, and we had a nice reunion with Kathy and myself, and it's theirs now, And so this is what it looks like. It's not, you can't really go out to where it was because it's out in the marsh, but the museum's on the edge of it. And that's when Jeb decided to make it a historic site. So now you can see it. We had fun designing it, designing the panels and the script. So it's an important educational moment that, we're basically rewarded for writing monographs. We're not rewarded for this kind of stuff, and yet it's probably my biggest, most significant reward of my career. And so I always put up teaching resources, but your question is about the Seminoles. I remember you were interested in Seminoles. I stuck a few things in here because blacks, not all of them went to St. Augustine. If you weren't urban and literate, maybe instead you felt more comfortable out in the boondocks with the other Indian groups. And so I've also tried to map out where black Indian settlements were in Florida, and the black Seminoles are now, they fought all the way to the Supreme Court and have lost their rights. But also you would find blacks fighting in Apalachicola, Florida, where the U.S. Navy blew up a fort there in 1815, manned by blacks and Indians. There's one of the advisors to the Black Seminoles that I've written about in my last book. Abraham, he goes all the way to Washington with them to negotiate treaties, and then leads everybody out to Oklahoma. And so that whole area that we see here is connected through these different experiences of Africans in the diaspora, and we'll talk some more down the road a piece about the French. Okay. Thank you.